The Detective at War, a Sherlock Holmes story by Richard Barton. This adventure is one of 4 in the book Sherlock Holmes and the Great War. It is set in the spring of 1916, when Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson would have been in their 60s. The Detective at War, Chapter 1, London. I'd experienced enough of war wounds to assess the young captain as he walked into the ward. The way his left arm dangled as he moved told me instantly what had happened to him. I had seen other soldiers with conditions like his, but never one so young. His attempt to grow a moustache was only starting to succeed, and his pale skin looked as if it belonged on a schoolboy. He was tall but painfully thin, although, of course, that might have been because of his recent suffering. When he spoke, he sounded as if he had just left the school choir. "Dr. Watson?" "I don't know about doctor anymore, but yes, Captain John Watson at your service." I had given up medical practice many years ago. My small success in publishing the tales of my illustrious friend meant I had been able to take a comfortable retirement some years earlier. My medical knowledge, already somewhat dated, had atrophied. But then the Great War swept over all our lives like a tidal wave, and sitting at home reminiscing over past life and loves seemed irresponsible. I was a volunteer at an auxiliary hospital called Chalice House, assisting the medical staff where I could and doing small services for the patients, reading letters for those who could not see, writing letters for those who could not hold a pen. My most warmly welcomed service to this legion of heroes was to read to them from my books. A story was related most evenings in the mess hall. The young man continued. "Captain Herbert Yates, I need to talk with you in private." It wasn't a request. It was given as an order, with a sneer that told me he felt demeaned at having to speak with an elderly civilian. "With me? What about?" But I already knew there could be only one subject, one person that an invalided captain would want to discuss with me. Yes, the mess hall is usually quiet at this time in the morning. Do come along." As we turned towards the corridor, I saw again the way his arm hung. Probably a bullet to the brachial plexus nerve, poor lad. But it had removed him from active service, so here was another young man who would live to see peace, eventually, even though crippled for life. Most of our charges at Chalice House fitted the same bill. Young men, cut down in their prime, here to be prepared for whatever they might be able to do next. "A fine building you have here, Doctor." He said this as though he had been planning and rehearsing a compliment, as though such an attempt at conversation did not come naturally to him. As compliments go, this was a pale one. No one would describe Chalice House as a fine building. Squat, grey, leaking, even crumbling in places. Once it was the local manor house, and this corner of northwest London would have been countryside not long ago. Now it is an auxiliary hospital, set in a landscape of small factories and minor works, which had once manufactured agricultural equipment. Now they were turned to very different purposes. Tin hats, mess tins, cooking equipment, and other ancillary items for the national effort were the local product in 1916. "Captain, forgive me if I intrude, but I perceive you have some experience of auxiliary hospitals?" He turned to me and looked me up and down as if I had said something abusive. He seemed to struggle for a moment, as if unsure whether to slap me down or answer me. Reluctantly, it seemed, he chose to engage in conversation. "Since you ask, I do. I've spent some weeks at the Red Cross Hospital in Aldeburgh. Do you mind my asking what your role is here, Dr. Watson?" "Volunteer. My knowledge is too old, as am I, for me to be a medical practitioner. But I like to think I can help these young chaps get through what's happened to them and be ready for whatever comes next." We arrived in the mess hall. Weak, early April sunlight filtered across the rows of trestle tables. At the farthest one, a few men sat around playing cards. They wore a mixture of uniform, dressing gowns, and bandages. The smell of disinfectant was even stronger here than on the wards. Yates and I sat opposite each other at the table nearest the door, out of earshot of anyone. "Surely you could do more for the war effort?" My initially unfavourable impression of the young captain was sinking lower each time he spoke. "I think I am of the greatest service here. What more could I be doing?"
"You took part in the capture of the spy von Bork."
At this point the charade became too much and I laughed. "I drove the car! Von Bork was tricked, tracked and ensnared by Sherlock Holmes. That is who you have come to speak to me about, no? Why have you come to me? Why not go straight to Holmes?" Captain Yates's expression went from serious to angry. Or was he afraid? Had something happened to Holmes? Had Captain Yates come to deliver terrible news? But the answer I received was almost more devastating.
"Sherlock Holmes is refusing to cooperate. We seek his help on a matter of national importance, but he will not engage with me."
I did not believe it. Holmes would not refuse to help his country at its most desperate time. I sat in dumbfounded silence. What is it you need his help with?"
"I cannot discuss that with you."
His emphasis on "you" further underlined his opinion of me as someone far below his station.
"All you need to know is that I visited Holmes and explained my need of his assistance. I am aware you hold the man in high regard, but I found his manner unconscionable. He was very clear that he was unwilling to cooperate. It's just..."
The captain struggled for a word to express his disgust.
"It's tantamount to treason. I wanted to have him arrested, but when I told Colonel Hooper about our meeting, he instructed me to come to you. I require you to visit your former associate and convince him to cooperate."
Again, it was an order, not a request. I left the army a long time ago, but was quickly reminded of the type of officer I disliked in my regiment. Abrasive, overbearing, relishing having found themselves in a position of authority over others. He had been sent to ask for help from Holmes, had failed, and was now being sent to ask for my help. He didn't like these duties, that much was clear. I did not like being treated in this manner, but such a sentiment is of no matter in the context of this war. "Captain, I will do as you ask, although I cannot be certain of success. I take a day off on Mondays, so on Monday next I could take a train to Eastbourne and then..." But the captain cut me off.
"Dr. Watson, I have my car waiting outside. We are to leave now."
Chapter 2. The South Downs. The drive to Eastbourne took several hours. I had hoped we might stop for lunch, but Captain Yates had instructed his driver to bring sandwiches, so we ate those as we crossed from Surrey into Sussex. I gave up trying to engage the captain in conversation and tried to forget the cold by looking forward to seeing my friend. But I began to get worried. How would Holmes react to my arrival? I tried to call him on the telephone before we left, but there had been no answer and Yates would not be delayed. Holmes would not be expecting me. I hoped he would be pleased to see me, but when he learned the nature of my visit, would that change? He never showed much feeling, of course, but if he had refused to help the army, would he see my visit, on their behalf, as a betrayal? Why would he refuse to help anyway? I could not think of anything more unlikely, and that made my anxiety about the impending arrival increase. The sun was low in the sky as we pulled up at the small farm upon the South Downs that had, for some years, been the home of the world's greatest detective. Silhouetted against a spectacular sky just beyond the building was a tall figure dressed in a long white cloak, bent over one of a row of beehives.
"I need to go into town to make some arrangements. I will be back in an hour. Make sure you have convinced that man to do his duty by then."
The driver had opened the door for me, so I got out and the car drove away. I turned back to look at the tall figure, standing with his back to me. I started walking across the grass towards him, wishing it was gravel or something that would make a sound and so herald my approach. I was planning the opening words I would use to announce my arrival when Holmes, without straightening up or turning round, said, "You're late, Watson. I expected friend Yates would have got you here in time for lunch. Come and look at this." He turned, pulled off his beekeeper's bonnet and smiled. It was as if the decades fell away. My friend was just as tall and lean as ever, the eyes and chin just as sharp.
The hair was now white, and some wrinkles and liver spots marked his face, but age and occasional rheumatism had not changed him, at least not to me.
Watson, my dear friend, it is, as ever, the greatest pleasure to see you. Now look at this bee.
He pointed into the hive. There were hundreds of bees crawling about, while others flew in and out. It looked to me like random, chaotic movement. Is one of them the queen? Which one am I meant to be looking at?
See the one with the dab of white paint on its back? Wear this, and watch that one.
He placed the beekeeping hat on me, so the netting covered me down to my shoulders. I positioned my reading glasses underneath it, bent down, and spotted one bee crawling around on the end of the comb, a small white dot on it. At first it seemed to be just one of many crawling about, but then I noticed a pattern. It seems to be following some kind of plan, like a figure of 8. And when it does the central part, it's wiggling its thorax, like a dance. Who knows what it can be doing that for?
I believe I know. It is a signal to its fellows.
A signal? Signalling what?
I have placed a dish of sugared water over there.
Holmes pointed to a folding chair on the lawn about 20 yards away.
I placed it there a few minutes ago and dabbed a drop of white paint on the first bee to find it. Now it is back with its fellows and wants to tell them where it found the feast. You will see it is in a direction about 20 degrees from the direction of the sun. The axis of the bee's dance is 20 degrees from the vertical. I have also found a strong correlation between the number of wiggles in the dance and the distance to the food source.
I watched the dance for a little longer. Other bees were leaving and many seemed to be flying directly towards the little dish on the chair. Holmes, this is astonishing. How did you discover it?
A lifetime of looking for patterns and meanings. I have to say it has almost felt like solving a case to discover the language of the great but simple bee. I might draft a short monograph on the subject, but I might leave that to others. I believe we have other work ahead of us.
That's right, Holmes. The bee dance is fascinating, but there are more important matters for us. I was driven here by an army officer.
Captain Herbert Yates of the Surrey Regiment.
That's right. He said he had work for you that is of national importance. But then he said... I felt reluctant to repeat the accusation Yates had made.
He told you I refused to cooperate and has driven you here to persuade me to change my mind.
Of course, I should have known that Holmes would already know anything I might have to tell him. But is it true? You're refusing to help the army?
No, I simply refused Captain Yates. What did you make of him?
I have to say I did find him rather rude, officious and demanding. It's true I did not take to the man, Holmes, but he has probably been through a great deal. He was injured in battle. I've been working with injured chaps, and some of the stories they tell me about fighting in this war are simply horrific. We've seen bad things, you and I, but life and death in these trenches is something altogether different. I've not heard the like. But whether we like the captain or not, he's come to us for help. We have to do what he asks if we can help the war effort.
Of course we do, and we will. But we need to manage our friend Captain Yates. Let me close the hive, get these beekeeping things off and go indoors. I have a rather fine Madeira I would like you to try.
The house was a large cottage. I was shown the fine dining room with a magnificent prospect of rolling hills leading down towards the sea. This splendid room had been turned into the untidiest chemical laboratory on the planet. We adjourned to the sitting room, which could have been very comfortable. Instead, gardening equipment, seedlings in trays, books and periodicals were spread over every surface. I recognised some things. By the fireplace was a solid iron chest, which once held the Agra treasure. On the mantelpiece was a small black and white ivory box, sent to Holmes by Mr. Culverton Smith and formerly armed with a spring-loaded poisoned needle. And above that, in pride of place, the photograph of Irene Adler. Holmes poured us each a glass of red wine and sat in a leather armchair by the fireplace. I cleared some newspapers and gardening gloves off the opposite chair and sat down as well.
Now, Watson, do you wish to deliver a rebuke for my failure to answer my country's call?
Of course not. I knew there must be an explanation. And you, of all people, deserve to hear it. You have seen many of my first meetings with clients. They have come to me wearing a mask. The King of Bohemia, I remember it well. If I had not, the photograph above the fireplace could not fail to remind me. I do not wish to have a client who wears a mask, even if he is a king. You will remember also, I have no doubt, that I was less than completely honest with Dr. James Mortimer and Sir Henry Baskerville when I told them I was unable to travel with them to Dartmoor. So, Holmes, are you saying that you see the British Army currently engaged in what history will describe as the greatest war we have ever had to wage as just another client? As you indicate, probably the most important client I will ever have. All the more reason to get the terms right at the start. Captain Yates arrived here yesterday and told me to put myself under his command. He then started to recite a list of conditions and rules that I must follow. I heard him out and then told him I would not accept his command nor any of his conditions. He did not know how to react, so he made a number of vague threats and departed. I knew that, if the need for my services was real, another approach would be made, and so it has proved. Enjoy your wine, Watson. I will telephone a woman in the village who assists me with the housekeeping. She shall make up a bed for you for tonight and prepare a meal for us. When Captain Yates returns, you can tell him that I will accept his case under my conditions, not his, and that we should be ready to depart for any destination he decides at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. After so many years of association with Holmes, I am accustomed to finding myself in situations which I do not fully understand. I have waited in an empty house, watching a shadow in the window of our Baker Street home just hours after Holmes revealed himself as still alive and not, as all believed, dead beneath the Reichenbach Falls. I have waited in darkness in a bank vault with no idea how the mystery of the Red-Headed League had led us there. Once again, after so many years, I had the familiar sensation that I was lacking awareness of some vital truth. In the past, it worried me very little. I simply trusted that Holmes knew what was afoot and what to do, and that all would become clear eventually. This time, however, I had some concern. Had Holmes delayed his service to his country by a day because of some minor argument between him and Captain Yates over who was in charge? I felt sure Holmes would have been able to negotiate a suitable understanding between them without sending the captain away. Perhaps Yates really was an impossibly unreasonable man, but he seemed polite enough when I went out to his car on his return and promised we would be at his disposal from 9 o'clock. I mentioned that Holmes wanted to work under the conditions he had given to the captain the day before. Yates simply nodded and said, "Yes, I should have thought it obvious I agreed to that," before wishing me good night and driving away to sleep at a local inn. Chapter 3. Folkestone. I had been to Folkestone once before. Many years ago, my late wife and I had a short holiday there. I remember our pleasant walks together on the Leas, the wide strip of public park that runs along the top of the cliff. I hardly recognised it on my return. The Leas had become a vast army camp with men in khaki constantly coming and going. Captain Yates, Holmes and I had been driven to this part of the Kent coast after I had spent the night at Holmes's house. Yates said he would find Colonel Hooper and arrange a meeting. He suggested we rendezvous at a cafe at the top of the old High Street at 1 o'clock. This gave us time to stretch our legs after the journey. We walked past the two great hotels, the Metropole and the Grand, once bitter rivals but now united in service, hosting military hospitals, officer accommodation, and even, we were told, the Belgian royal family. Between the hotels and the cliff were rows of tents. Men from across the empire were arriving, while those departing for France marched down the slope to the harbour. I saw regiments from England, Wales and Ireland. Soldiers from South Africa mingled with men from Newfoundland. Troops from Scotland camped beside men from Bermuda. And everywhere I looked, there were Canadians. Holmes and I must have looked out of place. We were far older than anyone else we saw. Holmes wore a Norfolk suit, tweed cap,
and one of those long neckties that became fashionable before the war. It was black with pink stripes, and he said it was a college tie. I wore a dark suit with a bow tie and a brown trilby hat. Edwardian fashions would have been normal in a seaside resort just 2 years previously. Now the town was dominated by young men in military uniforms. We arrived at the cafe on time. Waiting for us were Captain Yates and a man who had a look I had learnt to recognise at Chalice House. The laughter lines of a face that had once been jolly, but which had acquired a greyness and the haggard appearance of those who have known horror. The loose skin around his face and jaw spoke of rapid weight loss. This was Colonel Hooper, and he brightened on being introduced to us.
Famous chaps, both of you. Very glad you've been able to come along. I can't say I've read the books myself, but my butler had them all, and he said they were cracking. Now, you're a consulting detective, and we rather need to consult you on a pressing matter. It seems the Germans have a way of knowing where our troops are. We had a corps of Australians go up the line, and when they looked into no man's land, they saw a sign reading, "Advance Australia if you can." The damn Boche knew they were there and put that sign up to let them know it.
Why would they do that? I asked. It seems a funny thing to do.
Not funny as in making a joke, that's for sure, said the Colonel. The Germans don't have a sense of humour. No, we think it was meant to scare the lads, as if to say, "Look at our sign, boys. See how much we know. We're always one step ahead."
Did it have that effect?
Hardly. The Boche can't know Anzacs very well. An undisciplined lot by all accounts, but brave. A unit from Tasmania prepared a sign saying, "Don't worry, Fritz, we're coming." And were all for putting that up facing the German line, but they were ordered not to, as it was seen as an unnecessary risk.
The waitress had arrived while Colonel Hooper spoke. We gave her our order before Holmes leant over the table to speak quietly. "Colonel, forgive me, but are you sure we should be having a conversation about such matters in a public cafe?"
"Oh, you don't need to worry about that. They're good people here. Belgians, refugees forced from their home by Huns. No one more likely to be on our side. Doing very well here too. Besides, no offence, but we're not meant to allow visitors into our office. The real hush-hush stuff is there. Maps, orders of battle, all that twaddle."
"How do you know they are Belgian?"
"What do you mean? What else would they be?"
The waitress returned and started placing saucers, cups, plates and cutlery. Holmes addressed her.
"Excuse me, miss, I'm told you are from Belgium."
"Yes, sir."
"May I ask where from, specifically?"
"From Leuven, sir, a little way east of Brussels."
"Leuven, it has a fine town hall, if I remember correctly."
The girl's face brightened. "You remember correct, a fine building, sir." Then her face darkened. "I feel sick at the thought of the godless swine who will be in it now." Then suddenly she remembered her station. "I'm so sorry, sir. I did not mean to become familiar."
"Not at all. I quite understand your strength of feeling."
She ran away to fetch our lunch. "Well, well, I am sure you are right, Colonel, and that she is as Belgian as King Albert." I felt compelled to ask Holmes how he knew about the town hall at Leuven.
"I did not, but most Belgian towns have a fine town hall. It was a reasonable supposition."
"Now, Colonel, pray to continue to explain your problem."
"Well, that's it, really. The Germans know who they're facing across the line. What else do they know? How are they finding out? We can't have that. That's why we are seeking your help."
The conversation paused when the waitress returned. Perhaps the Colonel had decided he was speaking a little freely. She laid out a teapot, water, milk and sugar. Then she started pouring out each cup of tea and asking each of us in turn how we took it. The process lasted an inordinately long time. Finally she left us and, as Colonel Hooper began to sip his tea, Holmes started his inquiries.
"I have a number of questions for you, Colonel. First, is the French army suffering similarly? Do the Germans know about their movements?" "Well, goodness me, Mr. Holmes, I have no idea. We don't discuss that sort of thing. I certainly would not tell my French contacts about our little problem, and I would not expect them to tell us if they have anything similar."
"I see. Then my second question. Do the men here know when and where they will be posted when they get to France?"
"Oh, certainly not. Neither do the junior officers. Doubt the senior officers either come to that. Plans change all the time." Navy's in charge of sailing across. We go when the Dover Patrol gives us the go signal. Troops are then dispersed across the Pas-de-Calais and beyond. There's training and what have you until the orders come to move up the line.
I understand. Therefore, information of troop movements is not being passed to the Germans from England.
Can't be. After all, the Australians didn't start from here. After giving the Turk a kicking, they landed in France, down south, Marseille, I believe. I would assume that some Frenchie down there was passing news east via Switzerland, if that sign was the only evidence we have. But I'm afraid to say they seem to know who they are facing all too often. We send raiding parties over, they come back with a few prisoners for interrogation. Seems they know far more than we'd like. That's what we've got to find out. How much do they know, and how are they getting that information?
Quite, which leads me to ask, forgive me if this seems impolite, if this matter is of such great importance, why is it being dressed by a party of 4 in a cafe in Kent? Should this not be discussed in Whitehall or Westminster?
The Colonel harumphed. You're reputed to be the top man in England for this type of puzzle, but I understand your point. We invited the official intelligence services to look into it, but they are not convinced that information is really leaking across to the other side. Besides, even if Germany has insight into our troop movements, well, it would be a matter of concern, of course, but it is not seen as making a difference.
I was amazed at this pronouncement. If Holmes felt the same way, he hid it. Could you explain to us why such a possible lapse in security is not seen as significant?
Well, of course. Don't get me wrong. We want to find out if something is happening, how the Germans are getting their information, and punish anyone who's helping them. But, as I have said, we don't see it changing the outcome of the war.
The Belgian waitress delivered a dish of cutlets to each of us, and the Colonel continued as he ate.
We have a big push coming. Oh, I know what you'll say. We've launched major offensives before and they did not bring victory. But this year will be different. We've got the biggest army yet. What you can see in Folkestone today is just a fraction of what we're building up. Then we have a new secret weapon. Now, this is something I should not say out loud in a public place, so I'll just let you have a whisper. Imagine steel bunkers, mounted with guns and motorised so they can drive across no man's land, across their trenches, and across Germany.
Holmes watched him carefully as he ate, and then asked, You are certain that the size of the army in these motorised bunkers will finally end it?
Well, it's not just that. Things are very different now from what they were even a year ago. The French have bled the heart out of the German army at Verdun. It cost them mine, but they did it. The Russians are going to attack soon all across the Eastern Front, and it's simply a question of numbers. The Germans won't be able to stop the Russian steamroller. Nothing will. Russia's also battering Johnny Turk from the north, while we move on them from Mesopotamia in the south. The Italians started slowly in Austria, but they've got the bit between their teeth now and are launching a series of hammer blows on the Isonzo. They're bound to break through eventually.
I was not sure whether to be inspired by this optimistic picture or horrified at his hubris. The idea that the war could be over in a few months was, of course, hugely appealing. I asked, Colonel, can we really hope that the war will, this time, be over by Christmas?
Before then, Dr. Watson, my estimate is the end of August. Peace at last. We will raise a glass to those we have lost in bars along Unter den Linden.
He was thoughtful for a moment, then continued,
There may be some mopping up to do here and there. Oh, and there's rumours brewing of trouble in Ireland, but there always are, it won't come to anything. But we still want to know how the Germans are getting news of our troop movements. That's the pressing matter. The question we want you to answer, Mr. Holmes, is, how are they getting this information?
Holmes took a bite of food and thought for a moment. You have said yourself that the information cannot be coming from England. It must be coming from somewhere where there is information on the movement of troops arriving from here and those coming from the Mediterranean. Your information is being collected in France.
Then you must go. I'll sign some chits giving you full authority to travel and make your inquiries. Captain Yates will have to accompany you. You must have someone from the military with you at all times, and I know you'll find him useful. So, will you go?
Holmes took his final mouthful of food The colonel watched him eagerly. The captain just looked furious. Holmes glanced at me. I nodded. Dr. Watson and I are happy to accept your case. Holmes and I returned to our hotel. Not, alas, one of the famous pair on the Leas, but a pleasant enough establishment, and waited while arrangements were being made. It was late afternoon when Captain Yates called on us. He explained that he had all the documents and permits required, and that we would be sailing in the morning if circumstances permitted it. Once we had gone through all these arrangements, Yates finally said what he had clearly wanted to say back at the cafe.
I have to say, Mr. Holmes, this trip to France is not what I expected at all. You are a consulting detective. Is that not the title you have created for yourself? Then I should have thought it was merely a matter of consulting you here, getting your advice and instructing people in France or wherever on the actions to take. Sometimes I am able to satisfy my clients without leaving my home. On many other occasions I have found it necessary to travel to solve the problems that a client brings to me. This is one of those occasions. Captain Yates looked as if he was having to chew his tongue back on what he really wanted to say to us. I never expected that we would have to go to France. Don't expect it to be a holiday. I don't know if you were in France before, but it's not as you might remember it. We shouldn't have to go. Chapter 4. Boulogne. We spent the night at our hotel. Captain Yates met us the next morning and greeted us with no more than, "Follow me." We walked down the narrow, steep street to the harbour, which was thronged with troops, horses, vehicles and supplies. Everything was loaded with surprising speed onto the SS Invicta, a merchant ship converted to a troop carrier and painted in the strange, dazzled camouflage. The voyage to France was uneventful. Our ship was packed with soldiers. Holmes spoke to some of them on the crossing, confirming none of them knew where they would face the enemy, although rumours were rife. One man actually thought we were sailing from Folkestone to Archangel to join the Russian forces there. But it was to Boulogne that we sailed. Captain Yates was unwell during the trip. The ship's captain invited Holmes and me to the bridge and offered us his hospitality. When his duties called him away, we were able to discuss the case in private. We've been involved in some serious matters, Holmes. The naval treaty, which was taken from poor young Phelps, for example. The loss of the Bruce Partington submarine plans was presented to us as a vital international problem. Then there was that mysterious letter which you returned to Trelawney Hope's dispatch box. Those adventures aside, I don't remember another case which is of quite such national significance. What can you tell me at this early stage? How are we going to discover how the Germans get their information about our troop movements? I do not consider the question of how they are getting it to be of great importance. But Holmes, the Colonel said that is the question they need us to answer. How they get the information? Any number of ways. We are in the 20th century, my dear Watson. For all we know, the Germans long ago laid a series of pipes under the French countryside and send messages through them by pneumatic pressure. He noted my sceptical expression. No? Then perhaps they have an aeroplane that they fly by night, painted black. Perhaps it is quiet enough or can fly high enough so that no one can hear it. Every night it flies to a quiet field somewhere in France to be met by an agent who simply hands the news to the pilot. That sounds possible. Do you think that could be how they do it? It could be, or any of a dozen other methods we could imagine before we disembark. That is why I do not think the matter of how is of great importance. We shall find out along the way, I have no doubt. But the question we must attend to now is not how, but who. At this moment I was called away. Yates and several other men were very sick, although the sea was not rough. I had seasickness when I sailed out to Afghanistan, more years ago than I care to remember, and I do recall just how awful one can feel. There was nothing I could do for those suffering, other than make them drink water, keep their eyes closed and their heads still, and assure them their suffering would end the moment we docked. And so it proved. Almost as soon as the gangway was in place, Yates summoned us and we disembarked.
Saying something about making arrangements, he pointed us towards a long, low building that might once have been a customs house, but was now an officers' club. The staff made us welcome once we had presented our credentials, and we were shown to a table with a fine view of the docks. Several ships were being unloaded. Cranes were lifting from out of ships' holds crates of supplies, artillery pieces, and several bemused horses. Men were everywhere, swarming about the docks, some lining up for a parade or a roll call, others overseeing the unloading of materiel from ships and its subsequent loading into lorries, and the great trains which pulled up right along the dock. For a moment I could not identify what I was reminded of as I watched these swarms of khaki figures. Thinking of the word swarms reminded me. Holmes, it's like watching your bees swarming around in your hive.
Yes, if only one of them was marked with a white dot, we would be able to identify the man who was the source of the information being leaked.
You don't think it's one of these men?
No, I think we are going to look much harder to find the spy we seek.
Where do we start? Holmes watched the activity on the quay for a time, then said,
First, I would like to get an idea of how troops are dispersed and what happens when they move. We need to find out when their destination becomes known, either to them or, what is more likely, I think, to those able to observe them. Next, we shall need to discover who can be observing them and drawing conclusions of their destination. Once we have that, we can trace the means of communication being used to collate the information that is being gathered. Then perhaps we will be able to capture the enemy agents and put an end to their work.
While I am perfectly capable of understanding all the words Holmes used, and the sentences he spoke made perfect sense, I was still entirely unclear about what we would need to do. You have a plan, then? Once again, a pause while we watched wounded men being loaded onto the ships for return to England. Some were able to make their own way onto the ship. Some led each other, crocodile fashion. Those behind the leader had bandages over their eyes. Some were lying on stretchers, which were placed in pairs on pallets, then lifted into the ships by crane.
I would not say I have a plan yet, said Holmes, but I have an idea of the first step we must take towards developing one. Where is that man Yates? He must have recovered by now.
He said he had to make some arrangements.
Possibly. I think it more likely he needed a walk to recover himself after the voyage.
Captain Yates arrived shortly afterwards. The colour had returned to his face, and, for the first time since I had met him, he looked almost cheerful. He ordered brandies for each of us, and drank his in one.
Well, gentlemen, I have arranged accommodation for us on the Grand Rue. How long do you think we will need to stay here before returning to England? Captain, at this stage I have no idea. Although I doubt very much that we will be long in Boulogne, I believe our next destination will also be in France.
The sour expression which had always adorned Yates's face until just now swiftly returned.
Another place in France? I see. So where do you propose we go? If we are to find out how the Germans are getting our information, we need to track that information from its source and seek points at which it could be being intercepted. So we start with this. Where are the decisions made about which units will go where?
Captain Yates just stared at him, so Holmes continued,
I understand there are staff officers up at the Citadel.
We could see the town's ancient fortifications from where we sat, crowned with the cupola of the basilica.
I suggest we take a walk up the hill and see what we can find out. Have you no plan, no design? Exclaimed the captain. I assumed you worked to a method and would be able to sketch out the steps of your inquiry. I understood that you have solved mysteries before and would have a good idea of how to crack this one, as well as how long it would take. He leant forward. I thought you probably already had a good idea of what is going on. Data, Captain, I must have data. It is a capital mistake to make theories before you have data.
This stirred a memory in my mind. One begins to twist facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts.
Quite so, said Holmes. You see, Captain, Dr. Watson knows my methods. One has to trace the threads, untangle them, and draw them together in order. When you have enough of them in your hand, you can begin to entertain possibilities, ruthlessly rejecting all that do not fit the facts.
exploring further when there remain multiple possibilities, until just one hypothesis remains which fits. I have had the opportunity to work on a great many mysteries. While some of them have had similarities to others, and many had no features of interest whatsoever, not a few were unique in the features of the puzzle they presented. Most of my work has been addressed at restricting the activities of the criminal classes, both in England and, I think, across 5 continents. This case is a matter of information being passed between great powers at war. I am most flattered by your presumptions of my foresight and ability, Captain, but I fear I must disappoint you. At this stage, we operate one step at a time. I have no doubt that my face shone with admiration at this brilliant speech by a great man who I am proud, beyond normal levels, to call my friend. But the young face of Captain Herbert Yates reminded me of the expression I have seen on the faces of many criminals at the moment when Holmes brought their careers to an end. Then I suggest, Mr. Holmes, that we take the first step without further delay. The climb up the Grand Rue to the Citadel is not far, but it is somewhat steep. When Yates pointed out the hotel to which he had had our bags delivered, I went in to borrow a walking stick. The Giselle bullet which wounded me in the Second Afghan War was now causing stiffness after any great exertion. But the stick helped, and soon we were at the mighty ramparts of the Citadel, built to protect France from invading English, now home to Englishmen here to defend France. We found a young adjutant and explained our need. I suppose the sight of a young captain and 2 elderly civilians asking questions about troop movements would have raised anyone's suspicions. He gazed mournfully at us, looking at each of us in turn, slowly. We showed him our credentials, which he scrutinised with great deliberation. I think he was deciding whether to have us arrested. But after a time he slowly said, "I think you had better see the General." He led us through narrow streets, which, while far from being deserted, seemed quiet and peaceful after the noise and activity of the port area. The people we saw were all British, most in uniform, Army and Navy, plus voluntary aid detachment nurses. We arrived at a square surrounded by fine buildings, the town hall, the courts, and the library. We were led to what had once been, I assumed, a smart hotel on a small scale. We were guided upstairs and ushered into a fine room, richly decorated and furnished, with dark oil paintings on the walls between windows which looked out onto a superb view of the square. The General turned out to be an affable Scot, General McStowe, who sat behind a large oak desk on which documents were arranged in columns. He was a large man with a florid face and untidy sandy hair. He listened, in some bewilderment, to the adjutant's explanation for bringing the 3 of us to him. I don't blame him for being bewildered, as the explanation was long and rambling. But then we presented our credentials, and the General's bewilderment became amazement. "The Sherlock Holmes! The Dr. Watson!" He came round from behind his desk and shook Holmes's hand, then mine, then Holmes's again. "I've read all the books at least twice. Brought them over with me. I've got the full set upstairs in my quarters. Nice to bring along something familiar, I thought, although I have to say, not had much time for leisure reading since I got here. But what tales! What adventures! Speckled Band was always my wife's favourite, but I'd have to choose something like The Greek Interpreter or The Dancing Men. Whoever would have thought you would one day present yourselves in my office? Can I offer you tea or coffee? No, well, never mind. Let's talk about your adventures." Captain Yates was completely ignored. His face was white and he looked sickened. The General continued to talk about those adventures of Holmes and myself which are known to the public, and seemed to have endless questions. How was the man with the twisted lip able to disguise himself so that his wife could not recognise him? Do you recall any of the funny stories which Mr. Rucastle used to amuse that governess? What was her name? What became of Sir George Burnwell, the rogue who stole the beryl coronet, or part of it? Holmes answered all his questions. It was the quantity of dirt which completed the disguise of Mr. Neville St. Clair. Holmes had never asked Miss Hunter about the funny stories. Sir George Burnwell was found dead in mysterious circumstances in Istanbul many years ago. I waited for the question which I knew must be coming, the question that all admirers of Holmes eventually asked. I did not have to wait long.
"Ah, now I tell you what," said the General. "What about all that deducing all manner of things from a person, just from looking at them? What can you deduce about me, eh?"
"General, I don't wish to presume. It can appear to be an invasion of privacy if I use my craft in that way."
"Don't worry about any of that. Have a go, I don't mind."
Holmes paused for a moment before saying, "Other than the obvious signs of your preference for Turkish tobacco, although current hostilities have forced you to change to Burley, your skill at golf, your being right-handed and a violinist, I would surmise a liking for card games, bridge most especially, and a form of fondness for whiskey until you decided to give it up."
Yes. Oh, I didn't think... Oh, you really are amazing, Mr. Holmes. It was a viola rather than a violin, but otherwise Yes. Now, I have been taking up your valuable time, and I am most glad to welcome you to Boulogne, Mr. Holmes. Now, how can I help you?
Holmes explained our mission. The General had heard that the German army was supposed to have knowledge of our troop movements. Like Colonel Hooper, he did not think it would make much difference to the outcome of the spring offensive.
"Still, we need to find out what's going on. Plug any leaks. Root out any villains. Of course I would like to help you, Mr. Holmes. Proud to. What is it you need from me?"
"May I ask you a series of questions? Firstly, where are decisions made about which units to post to the front line?"
"General Headquarters. That's GHQ in Army lingo. It's just moved, as a matter of fact. They set up in Montreuil, taken over a French military academy, about 20 miles south of here. That's where all the plans are made and orders issued. They're in charge of transporting supplies and equipment imported from England, and they manage the transport networks and even decide the construction of new roads."
"Do British military officials mix with French locals much?"
"Oh, yes, I'd have to say relations between us and them are pretty good. It's tough for the locals, of course."
"In what way is it tough?"
"Oh, prices of everything have shot up. There's rationing, and access to bars is strictly regulated for all. There's no street lighting, and everyone has to cover their windows at night so no aircraft can see it. It's called the blackout, but you know about that, of course, as Mr. Churchill has ordered it in all our coastal towns, and you have it in London now, I think. No one can enter or leave Montreuil after 8 o'clock. But, on the other hand, the Tommies spend their money there, and we put on various charity events and what not. I think the locals would be having a much tougher war if we were not there."
"Thank you. Now, once the strategists at Montreuil have decided a unit should move, how are the orders given?"
"A dispatch rider will deliver them. You see these chaps riding their motorcycles all over the country."
"You only use motorcycles. Would not a telephone message or wireless telegraphy be quicker?"
"We have telephone networks connecting GHQ with forward positions. From there, the infantry and artillery have their own networks. We have wireless telegraphy too, radios they call them now, but they're great big things, always going wrong. Besides, an order to move isn't something you can put in a simple message by telephone or wireless. You need to send maps, orders of battle, dispersion diagrams, and we also send cipher books, so we can talk later by wire or wireless, using terms that only someone with the corresponding cipher will understand."
The General returned to the far side of his desk and sat majestically in a high-backed wooden chair that he could rotate as he sat.
"Besides, anyone can listen into a radio message, and even telephone lines are not as secure as you might think. The ciphers and codes help, but in the end, the most secure system is to pack the bulk of the orders in a sealed bag and get them delivered by motorcycle. Then we can use telephones and, at a pinch, wireless to direct and coordinate. You might ring a unit and say, 'Implement order 27A at H hour,' or something like that. They look that up in the documents and know what to do. Anyone listening in is none the wiser."
It brought home to me, listening to the General speak of motorcycles, telephones and wireless sets, just how much war had changed since I saw my service. Whoever could have imagined that there would be so many ways to deliver a message? In Afghanistan, orders were delivered by a man on a horse. I have lived through an age of unprecedented change. Modern science and industry have brought us many benefits. To see so many of them turn to destruction is tragic. Holmes continued with his inquiries, and in response, the General explained how troops arriving from England were dispersed to camps across the British sector and occupied with training while numbers built up for the big push. He unlocked a cabinet and produced maps of the railway network, which formed the main arteries of military movement, and explained how lorries and trucks were being used for local transport.
Even London buses. If you notice there are fewer of them on the street, it's because they're over here moving soldiers about. Mostly, though, it's Shanks's pony.
I had to ask what that meant.
Marching, my dear Dr. Watson. We have regiments marching all over Flanders, Picardy and the Pas-de-Calais. Keeps the men fit, keeps them occupied, and gets them about.
Holmes asked more detailed questions about movement of troops for exercise, dispersal or training, and how a camp moving to the front line would differ from one moving to camp. The General explained that troops moving to the front would carry full battle equipment and supplies, while those marching to a training area would only have their basic necessities. He asked about different trucks and trains and how they might be recognised for what they were. He asked about present locations of army units.
Oh, very hush-hush, of course. I wouldn't tell anyone but you and your party, Mr. Holmes. You must keep it all under your hats until the war's over.
He spread another map over the neat columns of documents on his desk.
We've got men everywhere as we build up. Just yesterday, we sent the 1st Newfoundland Regiment to this area, northeast of Amiens. The day before, we moved the 36th Ulsters here, de Bouzincourt. While the day before that, we moved the 9th Battalion of the Essex Regiment back to near Le Touquet for some rest.
Holmes looked up sharply. The Essex 9th?
Why, yes, they were pulled out of the line 3 days ago. Why, do you know someone in that outfit?
I do. Well, General, you have given me a great deal to think about. If you will excuse me, I need some time to consider what I have learned. Perhaps you would indulge me with a further interview later, if it should be required?
Not only that, the General also insisted we dine as his guests that evening. Arrangements made, we left his grand office and returned to the town square. Once we were outside, Captain Yates turned on us, managing, just, to contain his obvious anger.
That man is a general in the British Army, Mr. Holmes.
I deduced as much, Captain Yates.
You questioned him as if he were a common suspect in one of your murky criminal cases. You should show more respect. How did you trick him into telling you all that information? That's military intelligence. The German army would give half a division to know what he has told you.
The German army does know what he has told me, or, if Colonel Hooper's fears are grounded, they will do shortly. That is why we are here. General McStowe has chosen to assist me and trust me. Indeed, he has trusted you as well, as you heard everything he told me.
The captain appeared to be chewing back his reply.
I will see you both in the morning. Please be at breakfast at 8 o'clock so we can plan the day.
You are not joining us at dinner?
As one so famous for making minute observations, it must have been clear to you that the General's invitation was extended to you and Dr. Watson. I don't think he even noticed me. Perhaps I have to prepare a report for Colonel Hooper. He wants to hear from me each evening.
With that, the captain marched off, his injured arm swaying limply. Holmes and I started in the opposite direction and ended up walking the town ramparts.
Well, well, so that was military intelligence, Watson. I think the term an oxymoron.
We paused at the corner of the walls, looking down on the harbour. A locomotive was just steaming away from the docks, pulling a train of wagons. How many pipes will you need to solve this problem? Holmes smiled at the reference. Just smoking pipes will not suffice to solve the problem, but I do need time to digest and consider. I must ask you to practice your great gift, Watson, that of silence. Let us walk. We may smoke, but I beg that we do not talk for the next hour. We met General McStowe, as arranged, in a restaurant just off the square. Our conversation began with Holmes having to explain his deductions to the General. While everyone knows that tobacco stains the skin of regular smokers, Holmes explained that the Turkish variety stains with a distinctive yellowness. The contents of the ashtray on the General's desk, however, could be identified as burley at a glance.
Holmes then asked the General to confirm that he had been playing golf the previous Sunday. That's right. One has to have some recreation even in these times, so I spent an afternoon at Wimereux. Not so bad course, a proper links. But how did you know that?
My hotel manager tells me that Sunday was a warm, sunny day, the first really sunny day of the year. The weather since has been cooler. Your Caledonian skin caught the sun, but not on your right hand, which is pale. Some golfers, often the most serious players, wear a glove on their lead hand. Conclusion, you are a keen, right-handed golfer who played last Sunday.
As you have been told many times, Mr. Holmes, it does seem easy and obvious, but only once you have been told. I would never have worked that out. Now the viola playing, you saw the marks on my neck.
You show the classic pattern for a violinist. I have played the instrument myself a little.
Yes, of course. But playing bridge does not leave marks on the player. How did you know I play the odd rubber? I looked over my room after you left. No cards, no card table, no clue at all that I could discover.
Holmes smiled. That was something of a guess, but the layout of the documents on your desk made it a safe guess in the circumstances. You had them arranged in columns, overlapping, to create a little set of paper stairways. It reminded me of the way cards are laid out in many games. Bridge seemed likely for a sociable and competitive man such as yourself.
And the other thing, the whiskey?
General, there is no need to feel awkward. I myself have a former habit with a substance much more malevolent than alcohol. Our vices leave their traces. It shows in your face. It could have been wine or beer or something else. I assumed, however, that a proud Scot would make the patriotic choice. But there were no signs of drinks in your room. There were some bottles of cordial in the cabinet and a pitcher of water. You offered us a hot beverage, but nothing stronger. The wine list provided by the waiter remains at your side unopened.
You're right again, of course. I was drinking more and more in the years leading up to the war. People warned me about it, and I always said I could give up any time I chose. I just never chose to. Then, a year ago, King George promised that no alcohol would be had in the royal household until the war was over. That seemed to be the signal. I have nae touched it since.
I commend you on your willpower. An intelligent move. Now, unless you have any more questions about my little demonstration? The General shook his head. Thank you. First, then, I would like to summarise the case as I see it. Information generated in British Army headquarters in Montreuil is finding its way to the Germans. The first possibility is that someone in Montreuil is their supplier.
The General looked aghast. You cannot be serious! A spy in GHQ!
I also find the idea unpalatable, but we cannot discount the possibility. Many German and English families are intertwined. Who is to say there is no one who has chosen loyalty to his German heritage over his British one? There is also the possibility that someone is being threatened. If an officer has family in Germany, who is to say that their empire has not threatened some harm to them unless that officer serves them?
The waiter came over and we gave our orders. It did not take long, there was little choice available. General McStowe said, "One hears terrible things about what the Huns have done, in Belgium and elsewhere, but it seems hard to credit their high command with threatening a chap's family."
Indeed, it seems unlikely, as does the final form of betrayal from inside GHQ, blackmail. If an officer had been indiscreet, in a manner which would have serious consequences for him if found out.
Aye, Mr. Holmes, I see what you're getting at, but would that drive a man to betray his country? After all, the penalty for treason is a great deal worse than what you get for a spot of, well, you know.
The waiter delivered our consommes, and Holmes continued. On the whole, I think the scenario of a spy in GHQ is possible but unlikely. As well as the problems we have discussed, there is the matter of how a spy would get the information from GHQ to Germany. Montreuil is a closed community. People cannot simply come and go. Suspicious behaviour would be identified very quickly.
I am glad to hear it. So if possibility number 1 is weak, what is the next possibility?
The next scenario is that the information is intercepted between GHQ and the units that receive the order to move to the front.
Do you consider that more likely? Dispatch riders could be opening their pouches and copying information, but I understand there are very many of them. It is unlikely they are all corrupt. Telephone and wireless messages can be intercepted, as you have said, but without the physical documents, such intercepts are not likely to provide Germany with the detailed information she seems to have.
The last of the soup was consumed and the spoons placed down with a clatter. The waiter was swift in clearing the bowls away.
Well then, Mr. Holmes, what do you think is a likely possibility? I consider that it is the actual movement of the troops that is being observed and communicated. You have told us that a unit destined from the front can be distinguished from one heading for a training or rest camp. They travel across the country by foot, truck and train. They carry regimental insignia and equipment related to their function. A small number of agents, perhaps based at main camps, crossroads and railway stations, could observe and gather enough information for experts in Germany to piece together and determine much of the Allies' battle plans.
The waiter brought us fried sole, fried potatoes and a spring salad. The General sat in thought as Holmes and I began to eat.
But, Mr. Holmes, you're talking of a network of secret agents spread across the country. It would mean the Germans had dozens of men, from Switzerland to Belgium, from the sea to the front.
For the first time during our meal, I saw an opportunity to speak. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Quite right, Watson. In this case, we have not had the luxury of eliminating the other possibilities entirely, so we can only cast the current theory of a network of spies as the currently favoured hypothesis. It may not require such a vast number of men, but, like any hypothesis, it needs to be put to the test. And that, if I can have your support, General, is what I propose to do.
The General nodded. You have my support, Mr. Holmes, but for what exactly? How do you propose to test your hypothesis?
I need a team of agents, people I can instruct and rely on to perform a search of likely locations in the way that is required. I only need half a dozen or so. I have an idea where I can find them, if I will have your permission to borrow them.
Borrow them from where?
From the 9th Battalion of the Essex Regiment.
Chapter 5. The Touquet. After dinner, arrangements made, we passed the night at our hotel in the Grand Rue. I was woken in the night by the sound of someone screaming. It shocked me from my sleep, but then there was silence. I was not sure if I'd dreamed it or not. At breakfast, we informed Captain Yates of the arrangement we had made with General McStowe. Holmes had a contact in the 9th Battalion of the Essex Regiment, and the General confirmed that they were currently out of action in the area of Le Touquet. The General had countersigned the documents provided by Colonel Hooper to, as he put it, "give a bit more clout." He did explain that we'd need the local commanding officer to agree to the loan of a working party, but he thought that it should be forthcoming. "A name like yours, Mr. Holmes, carries more authority than a room full of generals, eh? Besides, I don't think they'll be needed for action again until the big push, and that's still a few weeks off." Yates took all this information with no comment. He just looked miserable. It was not easy for him to manage the French breakfast one-handed. I offered to help him butter his rolls, but he was clear and somewhat sharp that he had to learn to manage his condition. As we ate, a messenger came from the General to confirm the address of a villa in Le Touquet that was acting as headquarters for the battalion. The messenger explained that he was a driver and was at our service to drive us there. The journey was only about 20 miles, but it took 2 hours as the road was jammed with heavy traffic in both directions. The little roads of rural France were not coping well with the demands of a mechanised war. Finally, we arrived, and an orderly ushered us into the presence of Lieutenant Colonel Bridge, commander of the 9th Battalion. He was a serious man with dark hair, dark beard, dark eyes, and a deep voice, although he spoke very quickly. He looked through the credentials. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Captain Yates." He nodded to each of us in turn. "I've heard of you, Mr. Holmes, of course, and I have great respect for General McStowe. He made sure we got a comfortable billet for now, although no home leave this time. We've had a bit of a rough few weeks. Now, it says here you are acquainted with one of our officers and would like the help of him and some of the men. Which officer is it?"
"Captain Lestrade."
"I am his godfather." While my admiration of my friend Sherlock Holmes is as great as can be, he is sometimes infuriating. He has no respect for knowledge that cannot be applied to his work. That is why, very soon after our first meeting, I challenged him on his lack of knowledge of disciplines such as literature, philosophy, astronomy and politics. His assumption of the relative values of different schools of human endeavour meant that he would assume others, myself included, would have little desire for information that was not of practical value to them. In this case, I am also to blame. I had never, in all our encounters, asked Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard about his family. It was not until that evening, when we sat together over a drink in an officers' club, that Holmes explained. Terence was born during your marriage. As you know, we saw less of each other in those days. I'm not criticising you, Watson. I understand that Mary was your natural companion. The inspector honoured me with the request to become godfather to his son. After your loss and our renewed friendship, the subject never arose. Indeed, it occurred to me that it might be somewhat insensitive of me to boast of being a godfather when your wife left us before you could start a family. To return to my narrative, I sat dumbfounded while a corporal was sent to find Captain Lestrade. Meanwhile, Holmes explained his need. He wanted to borrow Captain Lestrade and perhaps half a dozen men to travel round the areas where British forces were, looking for clues. What kind of clues? I shall give the men a detailed briefing on where to go, how to behave and what to look for. But how shall... At this point the Lieutenant Colonel was interrupted by the sound of someone approaching outside at a run, and then a hard knock at the door. Bridge had only started the word "Come!" when the door flew open and in ran a young officer who gave the fastest salute to his commanding officer before starting to shake Holmes by the hand with great vigour. Mr. Holmes, godfather! I could not believe it when Corporal Harris told me you were here. This is marvellous. Lestrade was in his mid-twenties and had inherited his father's dark eyes and more of his bulldog features than those which, I recall, I rather unkindly described as rat-like. He was of average height and athletic, with considerable power in his long limbs. It is good to see you too, Terence. How fares your father? He's well. Did you know he's been called out of retirement to help train special constables? They're a volunteer police reserve. And your father is training them? Holmes's voice faltered but quickly recovered. Well, that is splendid news. I must write to congratulate him when I get back to England. Please do. He'll be so happy to hear from you. He turned to me. Dr. Watson, I know you by reputation, and Mr. Holmes has often spoken of you, always in the highest terms. Proud to meet you, sir. He returned to Holmes. We have so much to talk about, and you must tell me what has brought you both to France. But I have a comrade in arms who I know will want to see you as well. Is he here? Yes, I sent Corporal Harris on to find him. Here he is now. Lestrade had left the door open, so he was able to see who had arrived outside. Come in, Sergeant, and see our distinguished visitor. A squat sergeant with a cheery face entered the room, made his salutes, and then took his turn in pumping Holmes's hand. He was aged about 40, and I thought I recognised something about him, but I could not place it at first. Mr. Holmes, so good to see you, sir. He turned to me and shook my hand with great energy. And Dr. Watson, I don't know if you remember me, sir. I might have changed a little since you last saw me and my little band. I was stunned. Is it... You're not... Can it be... Wiggins? At this point, the Lieutenant Colonel, who was a patient man but needed to maintain the dignity of his rank, suggested we remove ourselves to continue the reunion, and asked Holmes to return to his office at 3 o'clock to go over the details of the request. Captain Yates, who had been ignored again, muttered his usual something about making arrangements, so the remaining 4 of us went for a walk along the promenade. I certainly needed some sea air to clear my head. Inspector Lestrade had a grown-up son. Holmes was a godfather. Wiggins was a sergeant. I tried to recall when I had last seen him, leader of the little rabble of London street urchins known as the Baker Street Irregulars. I concluded that it was when he and his team had been searching the Thames for the Aurora and Jonathan Small, although I then recalled that his band had also helped Holmes solve the adventure of the Crooked Man. Why, Wiggins, no offence, but I can hardly believe the man you have become. What have you been doing since the days of the Irregulars?
I have a timber business out at Romford, Doctor. You have a... But however did you raise the capital to start or buy such an enterprise? Why, Mr. Holmes... But he was interrupted. Really, Wiggins, I don't think the good doctor needs to know intricate details of your business arrangements. Who is running the shop while you are here? My wife runs it, sir, along with a couple of the lads who are unfit for service, and my eldest, who is starting to be a great help. And business is good? Well, booming, thank you, sir, mainly because of the war. All profits to the Red Cross as we... But once again he was interrupted. Once more, Wiggins, we must spare our companions from the tedium of business arrangements. Now then, Lestrade, Wiggins, we have a case. He had their immediate attention. All thoughts of other topics were forgotten. Holmes outlined the problem we had been given as we walked up and down. I was starting to feel weary and wondered if there was somewhere we could all sit down, but I was not sure if there would be any venue at which a captain and a sergeant could sit at the same table. Then you say Germany has a small army of spies spread across northern France? However would such an organisation have been created? Asked his godson. Holmes paused to relight his pipe. First, I do not say for certain that such an enterprise exists. At the moment, it is simply a plausible hypothesis which I mean to test. Second, I do not believe the network would need to be so very large. A small number of agents suitably placed could be all that is needed. Finally, it is clear, I think, that Germany always intended to drive through Belgium at the start of her next war with France. The two countries have been at war, on and off, since the Middle Ages. The attack from the north was clearly well planned. Far from it being unlikely that agents had been placed in France, I would consider it unusually remiss of the German Empire not to have such an arrangement in place. It might have been small to begin with, but they have had 18 months to build it. Now it is up to dismantle it. Just tell us what to do. Holmes walked in silence for a minute or two, the three of us following and waiting. When he was ready, he rapidly gave the words that properly began our investigation. Wiggins, I need you to find some volunteers, about 6 men. They will need to be inconspicuous, observant, intelligent, and willing to work just as the Baker Street irregulars used to. Yes, sir, Mr. Holmes. I've got a number of pals who'll be perfect. Let me round up the best. Very good. One more thing. They will need to be good cyclists. Next, Terence. I need to make a detailed survey. I need you to gather maps, pre-war and recent, roads and railways, whatever you can find. There's a good collection in the town library. They are all locked away now, but I think I'll get my hands on them. Battalion headquarters will have the military maps. We might have to go to them. I don't think they'll let us borrow any. That is reasonable. Finally, Watson. My request is that you find Captain Yates and determine whether he has made accommodation arrangements for us. If so, find the man who drove us here and have our luggage unloaded. If not, see what you can find us. I think we might be here for a day or two, so the car and driver can return to Boulogne. I felt that my assignment was rather less important than those of the others, but it was no time to question Holmes's allocation of tasks. Very well, Holmes, what shall I do when I've done that? He looked me up and down. My dear friend, it is important that we have good quarters. We need to rest after our travels in order to be at full strength, or as full strength as men of our age can be, to face the adventures which I think are to come. When you have found our accommodation, please send word to me at the Lieutenant Colonel's office. I will come to you as soon as I can. Now, I am meeting Bridge again at 3. That gives me time to make some telephone calls. We dispersed to pursue our different missions. I found Captain Yates reading newspapers in an officer's mess. He had booked rooms for us at a small hotel that had been taken over by the army, and had had our luggage taken up. He told me this in a few terse sentences, then returned to his newspaper. I found the hotel, went up to my room, and decided to lie down for a moment. The next thing I knew, there was knocking at my door. I made some kind of sound, and Holmes entered the room. Watson, what a puzzle this is! The best exercise for the intellect I have had for some years, having to think as the enemy think. What have you been doing? I sat up and checked my watch. It was almost 5. We have our team of Le Touquet irregulars assembled. Come and meet them! We returned to the battalion headquarters, where an upstairs room had been cleared and put at Holmes's disposal. Wiggins and 5 other soldiers stood up as we entered. Lestrade was also there and, sitting in a corner, Yates. I was furious to see he had brought his newspaper and was reading it, ignoring what went on in the rooms. Wiggins introduced us to his pals, and they returned to the folding chairs which had been arranged in a row facing a desk.
Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for volunteering for our adventure. Now, has Wiggins told you why you're all needed?
They all shook their heads, and Wiggins said, "I thought it best say nothing, sir, until you were able to give the full story."
Quite right, Wiggins, thank you. Secrecy is vital. I must ask you all to tell no one about this case, what I'm going to ask you to do, or what happens as a result, until the war is over. Do I have your agreement?
They all agreed in strong terms. Holmes proceeded to outline the problem as it had been presented to us. They showed rapt attention and asked intelligent questions. Captain Lestrade and I have spent the afternoon looking over maps to identify locations where the German army might want to have eyes. We are going to work out routes for each of you. Tomorrow morning we will all meet back here, where you will be given detailed instructions on where to go, what to look out for, and how to behave. It is vital that no one suspects you are looking for enemy agents, especially the agents themselves. One of the men raised his hand. "Excuse me, sir, but if I find an enemy agent, I'm going to want to let him know I've found him all too well. I'll want him to meet my fist before I hand him over to be shot." The other soldiers expressed their support for this action. "I appreciate your enthusiasm for our mission, Private," said Holmes, "but catching just one agent is not enough. We need to net the whole gang. If just one gets away, he can tell his masters that the game is up. The leader of the enterprise could start to build a new web of agents. No, I need you to identify likely agents without them suspecting for a moment that you might have identified them as such. You report your suspicions to me, and we work to throw the net wide and catch them all, the leader most especially." Another soldier raised his hand. "Excuse me, sir, what are we to say if we're asked what we're doing? We're not allowed to go roaming around France like we're on holiday." A few titters greeted this, although it was an otherwise question. "We'll give you chits to show any officer who asks your business. As for everyone else, including the other soldiers you speak to, we're going to prepare a story that you are surveying the land for locations of more army camps. Soldiers are pouring into France right now, and you say your role is to suggest where they can be sent. We will have all the details you need on this as part of the briefing tomorrow morning." A question occurred to me. "Holmes, will you and I be part of this team, going around looking for suspicious fellows?" "I'm afraid we cannot, Watson. We are obviously not soldiers. I need our irregulars to go where soldiers go. Our white hair and wrinkles would be hard to hide. Besides, we need to be here, so the irregulars know where to find us when they have something to report. Any more questions? No? Then I wish you good night, and we'll see you all here at 7:30 tomorrow." Our gathering broke up. I noticed Yates had already left. Over dinner, Holmes enthused about the prospect of action. "The Lieutenant Colonel has been excellent, Watson. Not only has he loaded us the men and bicycles for them all, we also have the loan of a truck for the day, so we can drive around dropping them off at different start points. That will save them all time. We've had a look at military maps, but I found the pre-war maps more useful, as the Germans won't have known in advance where the army camps would be, or even where the front line would be. Terence seems to have an aptitude for maps, and has helped me plan routes for the men. They're a bright lot of lads. I'm quite looking forward to playing schoolmaster for them tomorrow. I think we will be done by lunchtime, and then they will be on their way. With any luck, we will have suspects by evening." "Is there anything I can do at this stage?" "The time for action is coming, Watson, and that is when I will need your presence, as I have on countless previous occasions." After dinner, I walked over to the town casino, which was now a hospital run by the Duchess of Westminster. I walked around the wards, speaking to each man. Some were in talkative mood. Others seemed to have lost the power of speech. Some just wept when I spoke to them, and one man only made strange noises like a wounded animal. Their injuries were various, plus there were cases of trench foot and fever. The nurses were unfailingly jolly when with the men, and all exhausted when in their mess room. I was introduced to the Duchess. She showed me, with justified pride, the linen room and the X-ray equipment. She talked of problems with funding and supplies,
and asked me to stay as long as I could to talk with the patients. When I explained, as far as confidentiality would allow, what I was doing in France, she prepared a first aid kit for me to carry. We organised a reading in the main ward that evening. I related a story I have not published yet about suspected vampires in Sussex. However, as at Chalice House, I found these later, unpublished adventures with Sherlock Holmes were not nearly as popular with my audience of sick and injured men as the adventures I published in the last century. So I told them the story of the adventure of the engineer's thumb, and they were good enough to show their appreciation. The next morning, I went down to the hotel's dining room for breakfast. Holmes was not there, but I spotted Captain Yates sitting alone, so I went to join him. He was eating bread and cheese and, at first, showed no sign of having seen me. So I tried a friendly greeting. "Good morning, Captain. How are you today?" He took another mouthful, so there was a long pause before he spoke. "What are you doing here?" I found it a strange question. "I was planning to have breakfast." "No, Dr. Watson, what are you doing here in France?" I found this even stranger. "I am here to help Mr. Holmes discover how the German army appears to know the movements of the British army." I managed to keep my voice calm, which did require some effort. "How do you help exactly? Apart from writing the accounts of his work, what is your actual contribution to it?" "I have contributed in many ways. For example, I have often carried my service revolver when Holmes was on the point of confronting a dangerous criminal." Yates took another bite and ate it slowly before responding. "Do you think he will need such a service from you this time? With thousands of armed men in France fighting Germany, do you believe Holmes may require his elderly friend with a Victorian firearm?" "I have done much more. I have acted as his agent, messenger and witness. Once I had to become, overnight, an authority on Chinese pottery to distract a villain while Holmes procured essential evidence. That adventure was just one of many when my medical skills were needed, as the villain had acid thrown in his face by one of his victims." The captain finished his meal. "Holmes has another team of agents now. I don't think knowledge of pottery is going to help here. And you have said yourself your medical knowledge is now dated. So why has Holmes brought you along?" "We're old friends. Talking things over with me helps him think. I provide the companionship of someone he knows and can trust." The captain stood up and said, "You can't trust companionship," and left. I felt somewhat disturbed by this conversation, so after breakfast I went where I knew I could do some good, back to the casino hospital. Everyone there was pleased to see me return. I wrote letters for injured men and helped one fellow take his first step since his injury. I saw Holmes briefly at lunchtime. He told me that he had concluded his briefing to the men, who are now being driven off to start their hunt. "I hope we may have a clue by this evening," he said. I invited him to come to the hospital with me, but he said he had some more telephone calls to make and he wanted to give the puzzle further consideration. "Besides, Watson, I don't have your skills of putting patients at ease. You will do that much better without me." In the afternoon I helped change some dressings and fed a couple of chaps their lunch as they were not able to do it for themselves. I've moved men in various wheelchairs and bath chairs out into the square to enjoy some spring sunshine. Mostly I just had light conversations with them. They liked to talk about home, families and loved ones. I met a gunner from Chatham who knew Yoxley Old Place, where Mr. Willoughby Smith was murdered, and a private from Norfolk who knew Ridingthorpe Manor, the stage for the adventure of the dancing men. At dinner that evening, Holmes was preoccupied and downcast. The irregulars had all telephoned at the agreed time period between 5 and 6 o'clock, but none had any suspicions to report. Every time someone entered the room, Holmes looked up hopefully, only to be disappointed. It was late in the afternoon of the following day that a soldier came running into the ward and told me that Mr. Holmes required my presence at the battalion headquarters. I hurried over to Holmes's upstairs room. With him were Captain Lestrade and a tall, dark, middle-aged man standing by the desk, dressed in the uniform of a French officer. He had an intelligent face and sparkling eyes, though a tendency to frown.
Captain Yates sat by the door. "Ah, Watson, we have a thread in our hands at last. One of the irregulars, Private Harry Robinson, has telephoned in his report. There's a bar called Café Picardy in Amiens which has aroused his suspicions. We've just been discussing it. I think it could be what we've been seeking. Atia, how far to Amiens?" The French officer answered in excellent English. "About 100 kilometres, Mr. Holmes." "Then there's no time to lose. The Lieutenant Colonel has placed a car at my disposal, but we need a driver." He looked at me. "Of course." "Excellent. With Watson driving, we five can get into the car and... Hello, where is Captain Yates?"
We asked a sentry outside the building, who said he had seen Yates depart on a motorcycle a few moments earlier.
"He rode a motorcycle with only one arm?" asked Holmes.
"It can be done. It is not so easy, but many people learn," said the French officer. We found the car, climbed in, and set off.
"Drive on the right, sir,"
said Lestrade, who was seated beside me. That correction made, we were on our way. Chapter 6. Amiens. Once we were out of Le Touquet, Holmes made introductions. "Doctor, may I present Capitaine Louis Atier of the 10e Bureau. Atier, this is..." "Dr. Watson needs no introduction to me. Doctor, it is an honour." As darkness fell and I became accustomed to driving on French roads, the connection between Holmes and Capitaine Atier was explained. They met in 1894, when Holmes was assisting the French government in the tracking and arrest of Huet, the boulevard assassin. That success earned Holmes a letter of thanks from the President of the Republic and the award of the Legion of Honour. Atier was a young gendarme at the time, and they worked together on the case. It was the young Atier who actually clapped handcuffs on Huet. When the 10e Bureau was reformed in 1907, Atier, by then a lieutenant, was invited to join it. "Once I had formed my suspicions, I telephoned Atier and sought his agreement to assist us. The British forces have certain rights in France, but cannot make searches of a French citizen's property and have no formal powers of arrest. Having Atier in our party gives us proper legal coverage, as well as the happiness of adding a fine officer to our team." As we approached Amiens, there were traffic delays. A lorry had come off the road at an awkward corner, and horses were being brought in to drag it out of the way. I made a comment that no traffic was likely to get into Amiens for a while. "A motorbike could get past," said Holmes, which filled me with foreboding. At last the obstruction was removed and we continued into the town. Holmes and I had passed through Amiens in 1891 as we zigzagged from London to Canterbury, Newhaven, Dieppe, Brussels, Strasbourg and Geneva in the journey that ended so memorably at Reichenbach, but I could remember nothing of the town whatsoever. It did not help that it was blacked out. Luckily, Louis Atier knew the way to the railway station. When I saw it, I suddenly remembered our visit there in great detail, right down to the soup we had in the station restaurant. Private Robinson was waiting for us inside, and he gave us his full account. "Le Café Picardy is not 200 yards down the road, Mr. Holmes, sir. It's run by an American couple called Rian. The story is they're of French ancestry and so came over to do their bit. Ran a restaurant in Boston, they say, so it made sense for them to run one out here." "Did you speak to them yourself, Robinson?" "Oh, no, sir, Mr. Holmes. As you instructed, I kept my distance. Besides, it's an officers-only place. I learned about it by casually asking around and listening in, just as you has told us." "Well done. Was there anything particular that has aroused your suspicions?" "Well, sir, I heard an Indian lieutenant telling his sergeant that Mrs. Rian had been asking him what he thought of the British, and whether he supported Home Rule for India. Said she'd asked just a bit too much, if you know what I mean, sir. Mrs. Rian sets up a little coffee stall in the stations most days, which could be just more good work, or could be a chance to see the comings and goings. Well, I think what really did it for me, sir, was this afternoon. I was on the street watching a battalion of buffs leading the station, and there, an upstairs window of the place, is Mr. Rian, watching through a pair of binoculars. So I called in and said I'd wait here." "Rian, could be nothing, eh?" said Holmes, and everyone smiled, though I did not understand why. We walked along the road towards Le Café Picardy. The windows were dark because of the blackout, but as we got close we could see it was more than that.
There were no chinks of light and no one coming or going. The place looked empty. "Allow me to go, Mr. Holmes," said Capitan Attier. "We are an unusual group, but I alone can be an officer looking for a glass of wine and not knowing the cafe is closed. That will not make anyone suspect. Besides, I have my revolver." It made sense, so Holmes agreed. We four remained at a distance, while the French officer strode confidently to the door of the cafe and knocked. He waited, but there was no answer. He tried the door. It was open, and he disappeared inside. We waited for a few tense minutes while Attier searched the building. At last, lights came on in the cafe, and he reappeared at the door and called out to us, saying, "It is safe to come in. There is no one alive here." I hoped this was just a French way of saying the building was empty. When we got to the door, we saw Attier beckoning us to a back room, a kitchen. In there was a male body, face down, in an enormous pool of blood. I stepped through it and turned the body over. "That's him," said Robinson. "That's Mr. Ryan." "Slashed through the left carotid artery," I said, "probably from behind. A sharp knife. It would have been quick. The killer would have been covered in blood."
"Are you sure there was no one else in the building, Attier?" asked Holmes.
"They would have to be hiding well, I think. I will have another look. Captain Lestrade, Private Robinson, you will assist." They went upstairs while I continued to examine the body. I would say he has been dead less than half an hour. The angle of the cut suggests the killer was shorter than the victim. I'm sure the attack was from behind, so the killer is most likely left-handed. I looked up, but I was alone. "Holmes?"
"I am listening, Watson, but also looking, and I have found something." He emerged from a cloakroom, carrying a woman's mackintosh, which was dripping in blood.
Hello, what's going on?" asked another voice, and I heard Captain Yates speaking as he crossed the cafe towards the kitchen. "Got here at last, have you? You took your—"
He appeared at the door and caught sight of us, the body and the blood.
Oh my God, oh sweet Jesus."
He staggered back into the main cafe and was sick. I found a towel which I used to wipe my hands and shoes and went into the bar where Yates was pouring himself a brandy. It was clear to me that it was not his first drink of the evening.
"Sorry about that," he said as he pulled himself together. "Wasn't expecting it, that's all."
"You must have seen worse." He finished his drink.
"Far worse, yes."
Holmes joined us from the kitchen. Lestrade, Attier and Robinson came down the stairs. They confirmed there was no one else in the building, dead or alive. Holmes considered Yates for a moment, then spoke to him in a calm manner. "Captain Yates, please tell me exactly what happened when you first came here."
"Well, when I heard Robinson's report, I thought I'd come and take a deco. I could get here quickly and decide whether the people running this cafe were suspicious. I could save everyone time if they were legit and keep an eye out if not." He said this in an overconfident way, as if he were not really justifying his actions in the light of what had happened in the adjacent room. "Never mind why you came. I need to know what happened." "Well, I came in and asked for a glass of Burgundy. I asked the barman if he was the manager of the place, and he said he was. So I started asking him where he came from, his background, that kind of thing. He seemed happy to talk, although his wife gave me a sour look when she looked in from back there. Don't think I said anything to alarm him, just being friendly."
But I could imagine Captain Yates asking his friendly questions with a sneer and a knowing look. "Did he answer your questions in a friendly way?"
"He did, yes. Well, at first. He talked quite happily about Boston, the little place he had there, how he and his wife had heard about the Café Piccadilly and made arrangements to come over. All sounded a little rehearsed to me. Sounded as if it was a planned story. So I told him I knew Boston and asked him the name of his place there and exactly where it was. I don't know Boston at all, of course. I'd never left Blighty before it all kicked off."
How did he react then?"
"Got a lot less friendly, that's for sure. Said he was too busy to chat, although the place was pretty quiet. Started asking me questions. Who I was, what unit I was with, why I was with Amiens. I thought it fishy."
There was a pause.
"The Burgundy wasn't good either. Too new, hadn't been decanted."
Another pause, then Holmes said, "Please tell me what you said before you left."
The captain poured another shot of brandy. "Now, look here, Holmes, I've been through some pretty tough times over here. Lots of chaps have. We've seen things. I didn't know anything like that," he nodded towards the kitchen, "was ever going to happen."
I understand, Captain. I am not seeking to make any judgment. You do not answer to me. I respect that. I simply require knowledge of precisely what was said.
Nothing, really. I only mentioned that they shoot spies just to see his reaction.
Again, I could imagine Yates saying this with a sneer and a smirk.
Well, he went right in the face. Disappeared into the back there. I heard them talking. Sounded like a blazing row done in a whisper. Finally, I heard him shout, "No, enough! I've had enough! I'm not going to carry on with this!" A moment later, the wife appeared at the bar and said her husband was unwell and they had to close the cafe so she could take care of him. I drank up and left. Went over to the Carlton and phoned your men in the 2K to say they were almost certainly Huns, or working for Huns. Had another drink, then decided to see what was happening here. Found you.
Holmes kept his face impassive, although I wanted to knock the man down, and might have done if I'd been a bit younger and he was able-bodied. Very well. Captain Yates and Private Robinson, you have both seen Mrs. Ryan. I want you to go to the railway station and ask if she has been seen there. Robinson nodded and left straight away, but Yates asked,
Who should I ask? What should I ask them?
Ask at the ticket office. Ask if an American woman, you can describe her, has bought a ticket.
I don't speak the lingo. A few phrases, yes, but not enough to have a conversation.
Find someone who can translate for you.
What if I can't find anyone to translate?
I can go with the captain, said Attia. No, Attia, you are needed here. Captain Yates, please do what you can. See if you can trace Mrs. Ryan. If you cannot, please come back here. Yates looked around at us, got up unsteadily, and left. Attia, I think you should contact your local colleagues and inform them of what has happened here. Tell them it was a murder and that we have some knowledge of the suspect. Instead of leaving the building, Attia started back up the stairs. He saw my puzzled look and said,
Do not worry, my friend. I am going to the telephone. There is one in the office room upstairs.
Is it normal for a place like this, in a town like Amiens, to have a telephone?
He paused on the stairs. No, perhaps not. We see the telephone as a toy for the rich. I believe there are fewer than 500,000 telephone sets in all of France, not counting the military ones. But the telephone is not as strange as the things on the roof.
Holmes had been going through a pile of papers he had found behind the bar, but at this point he looked up. Why? What is on the roof?
I believe it is equipment for monitor of the weather, but I did not look close. It did not seem so material.
Show me. The four of us climbed to the upper floor, where there was a ladder to a skylight that led up to an area of flat roof. Attia had a torch which he found in the office, but the battery was dying. There was just enough light to see a maximum-minimum thermometer, a rain gauge, an anemometer, and a few other meteorological instruments. These instruments have not been read in a while. The thermometer shows a high that has not been reached since Sunday, and a low that was probably not felt here for several days. The rain gauge has not been emptied in over a week. If the Rians were amateur meteorologists, they have been neglecting their hobby.
We went back to the office, a small room with a window overlooking the street that led to the station, although it was currently covered with a blackout curtain. On the desk were heaps of papers, a pair of binoculars, and a telephone set. Behind the desk stood an iron safe and a wastepaper basket. Holmes rapidly looked through all the papers on the desk, then those in the wastepaper basket.
Ah! A common mistake. Lock your secrets in a safe, but throw your notes about them in the wastebasket. Troop numbers as wind speeds, perhaps? Temperature and pressure readings seem to represent regiments. Wind direction must simply be the direction of travel. Clever. A simple enough system to convert military movements into climactic ones. Attia, please call the exchange and ask them to tell you everything they can about calls from this telephone, especially regular calls or anything unusual. Attia picked up the telephone set, wound the handle, and began. We heard people downstairs and a voice called,
Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson? We left Attia to make his inquiries and returned to the bar. Robinson and Wiggins were there.
We bumped into each other at the station, said Wiggins. I called in my evening report from Douai, and they told me you were coming here, so I cycled over. Didn't know where to find you, so I went to the station, and there was Harry.
I am glad to see you, Wiggins.
Robinson, did you discover anything?
Yes, sir. An American woman, who could have been Mrs. Rian, bought a ticket for Paris shortly after the cafe closed. The ticket clerk was sure it was her. He'd seen her at a coffee stall. She seemed scared and in a hurry.
Then we must be on the next train.
There is only one more train to Paris tonight, sir. Leaves in 27 minutes. I checked. It was after 9 o'clock. I had not realised it was so late, but now that I was reminded of the time, I felt tired and hungry. However, the idea of seeking food in the cafe kitchen was repugnant.
Atia hurried down the stairs to join us. I have spoken to the supervisor and an operator at the telephone exchange. A call came from here to a number in Paris every evening at about this time. Indeed, when I made the call, the operator expected to be speaking to Mrs. Royen, who would want to be connected to her usual number. They are not meant to listen to telephone conversations, but the operator said it was all weather information, wind, temperatures, pressures, and that the French of Mrs. Royen was very bad.
Could they give you the address of the telephone she called in Paris?
No, just the number. They said Paris would know the address. They said that if an officer in uniform goes to the Paris Exchange in Rue de Lafayette, they are sure to be helpful.
Then there is no time to lose, said Holmes. Atia, call your local colleagues if you have not done so already, so they can take over here. Then call Paris and have some of your colleagues discover the address of the telephone number, then meet us off the last train from Amiens. Wiggins and Robinson, I think you should return to Le Touquet and speak to your colleagues when they next telephone in. Tell them to look particularly for any establishment that has weather recording equipment. Wiggins, you can drive? He nodded. Then you can return the car. We all shook hands, made our farewells, and the two soldiers left.
Captain Yates appeared at the door of the cafe. I've asked around, Mr. Holmes, but I can't find anyone who has seen Mrs. Rian. She seems to have vanished.
Chapter 7. Paris. We bought food at the station, and I ate, then slept as we rattled down the track to the French capital. I woke up at Chantilly, the final stop before our destination. Holmes, Capitaine Atia, Captain Yates, Captain Lestrade, and I travelled together in one compartment. We steamed into the Gare du Nord just before midnight. Waiting for us on the platform were two men in the uniform I now recognised as that of the Deuxième Bureau. I am sorry we cannot provide a greater force, Mr. Holmes, said Atia. We are rather short of men at the moment. His eyes moved to a nearby platform where a train was unloading. Dozens of men wearing the blue of the French army, plus, in many cases, the white of bandages, were being guided out of the station. Some were told to wait, and they just collapsed, exhausted, on the ground. More injured men, not able to walk, were being loaded onto trolleys and wheeled away. We adjourned to a station bar. The barman was about to close, but Atia handed him some money, so he shrugged and retreated to polish glasses behind his bar. The two Parisians were introduced to us as Lieutenants Dubois and Grandvillain. They spoke no English, but Atia acted as interpreter. Holmes asked if they had tracked the address for the telephone number that the Royens called each evening. The three Frenchmen discussed for a time, then Atia gave the answer. They think we have this wrong. The telephone number belongs to a very fine man called Monsieur Anton Marron. He is a famous patriot, because his family were refugees from Alsace after it was taken by Prussia in 1870. They were forced to leave their home when he was a boy and came to Paris. He has built an engineering business here and done very well. He is a philanthrope, you have this word in English? Gives money to good things. They think it cannot be he who is part of any conspiracy to assist Germany. They say he helps France. That is why just two men have been sent. Colonel Dupont knows your name and respects it greatly, but believes this may be a false lead. How does he help France? Asked Holmes. The French officers spoke together again, and Atia reacted strongly to something one of them said. He turned to us with a smile. Very interesting. They say Marron provides weather forecasts. Dubois here remembers reading about him in a newspaper. He was an amateur weather forecaster before, and now he uses his skill to provide weather information to Le Ministère de la Guerre, the Ministry of War. It seems his weather predictions are close to what happens on most days. Where does he live? Asked Holmes, and the officers conversed in French again.
He has a round house in the 16th arrondissement. Dubois and Grandvelan drove past it before coming here. He has a tall pole against the side of the house with his weather instruments on top, high above the houses, so there is no interference with his measurements of the wind.
Very good, Attia. Please explain to your brother officers that we need to arrest Monsieur Maron and anyone else who might be in the house. They need to be brought to your headquarters for questioning and cannot be allowed to contact anyone outside the military and police forces as we make the arrest.
Attia explained this to his colleagues, then Holmes continued,
Warn them that it could be dangerous. If Maron is an enemy, he may attempt to fight rather than be taken.
I may not speak French, but it was clear that the French officers were not going to shirk in the face of danger. Attia spoke for them.
They say they are entirely behind you, Mr. Holmes. They know you hold the Légion d'honneur and will be proud to assist you in arresting any enemy of France.
We did a quick review of our weapons. The 3 French and 2 British officers all carried sidearms. We were asked if we wanted weapons. I had not fired a gun in many years and would be a danger to myself and my colleagues. Holmes also refused, saying,
I am confident that we have enough firepower from you younger men.
Dubois and Grandvelan had brought a truck with them. The 3 Frenchmen sat in the cab at the front and we 4 British in the back. The atmosphere was silent and tense. I heard a clock strike midnight. There was little traffic on the roads. We rattled along the streets as most of them are paved with stones and the truck had poor suspension. Because of this, I couldn't be sure if Yates was shaking from the motion or for some other reason. Terence checked his revolver twice. The truck had canvas sides, but I could see out of the back. Paris was not blacked out, but the street lamps were off as a small hour's economy. Nevertheless, there was enough light from the moon, stars, and the occasional lit window to see the city once my eyes had adjusted. I saw the Arc de Triomphe recede behind us and, shortly afterwards, the Eiffel Tower across the Seine. Particularly after the past few days, the city looked remarkably tranquil. It was hard to believe that war raged only 50 miles away, and that we were on our way to a possible confrontation with an agent of the aggressor. Finally, the engine was cut, the truck coasted to a halt, and our French comrades joined us in the back. Attia pointed down the road. About 80 yards away, a road branched off from the road we were on, at an acute angle, making a V shape pointed at us. Straddling the apex of this V was a fine mansion, in red brick, with white stone at the corners and around the tall windows. It had 3 stories, the top one in the form of a mansard roof. It looked archetypically Parisian, except for the tall pole that ran up the side of the building and extended 20 feet above the roof. I could just make out instruments of some kind on the top. In front of the house, filling the tip of the V between the 2 streets and the building, was a triangular garden surrounded by high railings between stout brick pillars. To get to the house, one had to enter a gate in this fence and then approach the front door. It suddenly looked very secure to me, like a miniature fortress disguised as a home. All of the windows were dark. With your permission, Mr. Holmes, we have discussed a plan.
We are in your land, Attia. It is right for you to lead.
Thank you. Dubois and Grandvelan will go by the left-hand side of the house to cover that side and see if there is access to the rear. Captain Yates, Captain Lestrade, can I ask you to do the same for the right-hand side?
Terence nodded, but Yates intervened. But it's the middle of the night. Would it not be better to wait until morning? We could get more men and surround the house properly.
Attia shook his head and continued. No, Captain, I think we must act now. The alarm raised at Amiens will have reached here by now. I think it possible the birds have already flown the nest, and we will find the house empty. But if not, we must act before they do escape. I will approach the front and say we have urgent need to consult with Maron. I will say we have heard there is a storm coming tomorrow and we have a big action planned for early tomorrow, so we need his advice on the weather. If he is a true Frenchman, he will admit me to the house and I can speak to him. I can ask him to come with us. If he does not let me in, I will tell him I know him to be a German agent, that the house is surrounded and he must surrender peacefully or be taken by force. Are we all agreed on this?
What about Holmes and me? I asked.
Perhaps I did ask rather forcefully, as the idea of staying away when action was needed did not appeal. "We must wait here, John," said Holmes. I was struck by his use of my name. I realised afterwards that he used it to give his statement impact. "This action is for the young men. We will be called when we can contribute." So the young men set off. 2 French went off to the left of the house and 2 British to the right. The garden gate was also on the right, and the tall figure of Louis Attier took his position there. I saw Terence move down the far side of the house to the corner, where he could cover the side and the rear of the building, while Captain Yates stayed by the corner nearest to where Holmes and I sat in the truck. It appeared there was some kind of speaking tube, or one of those local telephone systems called an intercom, at the garden gate. We watched Attier having a conversation into it, though we could hear no words. Time seemed to stop. Suddenly I heard Attier shout, "Grenade!" There was a flash and a bang, which I felt more than heard. I heard screaming and gunshots. My eyes had been confused by the flash, and when they recovered, I could see Attier crouched by a pillar in the garden fence, exchanging shots with someone in the house, while Captain Yates ran towards us, screaming, his right arm gripping his left to stop it flapping. He hurled himself into the truck between the 2 of us and crouched in a ball against the back of the track. "I can't stand it! I can't stand it! Peter! Peter! Oh God, no, no, no!" He ranted while Holmes and I managed to get him sitting on a bench. Occasional gunshots still rang out behind us. "Who is Peter?" I asked. "My friend, my dear friend. We knew each other all our lives, always best friends. Through school, into the army, half his head blown away, just one eye left to watch me, staring, accusing." He dissolved into sobs. "And the rest of them with him, the lads, the pals, in pieces. Poor lads, I can't do it any more. I'm a coward, I'm a shit, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Peter." The gunfire seemed to have stopped. "Captain Yates, Herbert," I said, "you don't have to do it anymore. You've done your bit. You were wounded, fighting. You're a hero." "No, no, I'm a coward. I stood up when I saw them all, the pieces, Peter's eye watching me. I stood up above the parapet. I wanted to be shot." "You could have been killed." "I know, I don't care. I wanted to be killed. I wanted an end to it all. Bloody Germans couldn't even do that for me, though. Just got my shoulder. Turned me into a cripple. More of a cripple than I was already. I can't go on. I'm sorry I've been such a cad to you. I was terrified of having to come back to France. I want to go home. I want to die. I can't bear it anymore. Peter promised he would stand by me, be my companion through it all, but he's dead. They're all dead, and one eye looking at me." There were more bursts of gunfire, and Yates squealed, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. You were right to insist on Dr. Watson coming, Mr. Holmes. I was wrong to try and order you about. You're so much better than I am. Everyone's better than me. I'm a coward. I let Peter die." "Dr. Watson, come quickly. There's a casualty." It was Terence Lestrade. He was running from the house towards us. "It's safe, it's over. You should come too, Mr. Holmes. Is Yates all right?" "He's not hurt," I said, though I knew that only meant he had no new injury. I still had the first aid kit given to me by the Duchess at Le Touquet. Holmes and I followed Terence to the house while he explained what had happened. They were preparing to leave, but were ready for an attack. They threw a grenade at Attier. Luckily it hit the railings and fell below the low wall at the base. He's a bit stunned, but unhurt. Well, with that we knew for sure you were right, and we had them. I went round the back and found their car, which was loaded, ready for them to make a getaway. We got here just in time. They were going to shoot it out, but Granvillard climbed a drain pipe and kicked an entry to the upper window. You can see all the lower ones are barred. Once they knew their defences were breached, they ran out at the back and jumped into the car, but I disabled it so it wouldn't start. They were shooting at Dubois and me, but we got them." We turned into the driveway at the back of the house and saw our 3 French comrades and a car that had bullet holes in its windscreen. An imposing man of about 50 with a magnificent walrus moustache sat upright in the driver's seat, quite obviously dead. A woman was lying on the ground, bleeding profusely. The French officers were trying to stem the bleeding, but they stood back when I arrived. I pressed wadding over the wounds in her chest, but it was immediately clear that the exsanguination was catastrophic, and she had just minutes left in this world.
"Mrs. Rien, I presume?" said Holmes. The name's Ryan, and it's Miss, she groaned in an American accent. Who the hell are you? My name is Sherlock Holmes. So the man you murdered in Amiens was not your husband? Sherlock Holmes, the great detective. Well, I suppose I should be honoured, although I see no honour in meeting any English. No, Holmes, he was not my husband. Maron paired me off with him, thought it would look more natural if we were a couple. Anthony Mantels, he was called. Tony. Supposedly of German heritage, but you'd never know it. He was an oaf and a coward. He was getting more and more scared of what we were doing. He kept saying America will eventually join the British and French. He wanted to surrender, to go over to your side. She said this with all the contempt she could muster in her weakened state. I told him I would kill him if he did. Tonight something happened. Someone came to the bar and as good as told him we were rumbled. He said he was going to hand himself in, so I killed him. It wasn't murder, it was the execution of a traitor. You must see that. She seemed to be pleading for our understanding of her appalling action, which I hope meant she felt some remorse. I'd warned Maron that Tony was a weak link. I told him what might happen. For all I knew, Tony had already shopped us. So I followed the plan. Get here and fly. We knew the game would be up sooner or later. She sighed, and the sigh turned into a groan. If we had left 10 minutes earlier, we would have been in Lausanne by sunrise. But we had to call the others to warn them. Holmes exchanged a look with Atia, who ran inside the house. How was Maron persuaded to betray his country? Asked Holmes. He didn't. He served his country. He is from Alsace. And Alsace is part of Germany. France invaded and took it by force, but many families remember their prosperity under German rulers. Yes, Anton's family moved here in the 1870s and have done very well, but Anton was always German. For a long time, he simply kept quiet. It didn't matter, and it was easiest to stay silent about his loyalties. But he stayed in touch with his fatherland, and when the need arose, he was ready. And Belgium? Asked Terence. Is that part of Germany too? She stared at him for a few seconds. You British, you're all such hypocrites. You pride yourselves on your empire. All those countries you paint pink on your maps to show they are yours. Countries you have taken, stolen, invaded, occupied. Countries you drain and bleed. But if Germany should take Belgium, oh no, that is a crime. And you send your young men to die in the mud and at sea for a pointless little country that was invented less than 100 years ago to please the great powers and give territory to a minor aristocrat. Talking had sapped her remaining strength, but she looked at me and rallied. You're the man, Watson? You write the stories. I don't believe half of them. But write my story. Write what we did, how we fought you. Will you? Will you write my story? I did not answer her, and after a minute, no answer would have been heard anyway. Chapter 8. Dover. The sun shone brightly on the white cliffs as we approached, two old men on the prow of a Royal Navy motor launch. We had spent a few days in Paris, resting after our adventures and helping the authorities complete their investigations. Louis Attier had contacted the Paris telephone exchange as Miss Ryan lay dying and got the numbers that had just been called from the house of Anton Maron. He might have told us more, but Holmes insisted he did not, knowing that the whole episode was to be kept secret. A quantity of electrical equipment had been recovered from the house in the 16th arrondissement. It had been sealed in a large crate that travelled with us to Calais and was now stowed in the little boat that was taking us to England. It was destined for the Marconi Company in Chelmsford, where they discovered it was a transmitter for very low frequency radio waves.
The tall mast at Maren's house was not just a support for weather instruments. It was for transmitting radio at a frequency far below any previously in use, and so not watched for by the Allied side. Terence had returned to his regiment at the Touquet, and the men of the 2e Bureau had returned to their duties. Captain Yates was below, the seasickness having taken him again. In our walks in the Tuileries garden and along the Seine, I learned more about Herbert and his friend Peter, who had died with one of his platoons when a German artillery shell exploded in their dugout. Herbert could have taken discharge from the army when he was crippled, but he stayed as he felt so ashamed of his behaviour. This despite having served over 20 spells in the front line. Finally, he had agreed he should seek his discharge, as no longer physically fit for war service, when we got home. Above the cliffs, King Henry's Keep stood, firm and redoubtable, at the heart of Dover Castle, the key to England. Holmes had been silent, puffing occasionally on a modern short-stemmed pipe. A question occurred to me. How did Marin manage to provide good forecasts of the weather to the French authorities? Holmes took a couple of puffs. Maybe he did know a little meteorology, but if you predict the weather tomorrow will be the same as it is today, more than half of your predictions will be correct. We watched a seaplane take off from inside the harbour and turn over St. Margaret's Bay as it began its patrol. We did some good, didn't we, John? I was astounded at the question. Good? My dear friend, we have done great work this week. Who knows how long Marin's network of spies might have continued their infamous work if you had not ended it. I have seen the messages of thanks you have been sent. General Haig, General Joffre, Marshal Petain, they all wrote to congratulate you. And urged me to keep the story secret. They don't want the world to know how the Germans had them in their sights for so long. This will be another of our adventures that you will have to consign to your archives until this war is long over. No, I meant before these times. We did some good in the last century, in the days of the old Queen. I was even more astounded. I had noticed over the past week that Holmes had changed. He had become more mellow and more relaxed, even using my first name. We change with age. Could it be that he was now showing some doubt about his towering achievements? You really need to ask, Sherlock? I used his name for the first time in a private conversation with him. You have ended the evil careers of terrible men. Professor Moriarty and his gang, Colonel Moran and the rest, would be top of the list, but there have been dozens. Murderers, thieves and blackmails who would have continued their lives of crime if you had not stopped them. And then there are all those who were not career criminals but had caused harm or were about to until you stopped them. You have returned countless items of stolen property, saved innumerable lives, and brought freedom to people who were wrongly accused of the crimes of others. Yes, yet now we see whole countries being stolen and killings on a scale the world has never seen before. It makes our efforts look small. I could imagine how his work, however magnificent, was on a miniature scale against the horror of the Great War. I composed my reply before delivering it. No act that does good, however small, is made pointless by any act of evil, however great. He looked at me and smiled. As ever, my old friend, you provide me with your honest good sense. I just want this war to end. Your work this week will have helped it come to an end. If all goes as hoped, it will all be over before the leaves turn this autumn. Let us hope so, he said.
The End. Copyright Richard Barton 2023. If you enjoyed this story, it and 3 more cracking adventures are in the book Sherlock Holmes and the Great War, available on Amazon. Take a look. Before you go, here is some real historical context for the story. There were auxiliary hospitals across Britain in the Great War, providing care for servicemen. Bees do a waggle dance to communicate the location of food to their hive. This was first fully proposed by Karl Ritter von Frisch in 1927. Folkestone was a major departure port for troops and equipment heading for battlefields in Europe, and large areas of northern France were home to the military forces of Britain and what was then the Empire. Troops were stationed in holding areas in the build-up to the Big Push, the Battle of the Somme. German troops facing an Australian trench did erect a sign reading "Advance Australia if you can," but not until a few months later than suggested in this story. The British General Headquarters in France moved to Montreuil-sur-Mer at the end of March 1916. Winston Churchill ordered plans for a blackout of coastal towns in 1913. These were implemented in August 1914. A partial blackout of London and other cities followed, and there was a general blackout in England from February 1916. The Duchess of Westminster did open and run a hospital in the Le Touquet Casino, and it did have an X-ray machine. Gaining information of the movement of enemy troops was of immense value to both sides. The Allies built an elaborate organisation of train watchers in occupied Belgium and Luxembourg, with many brave people risking their lives to get information to the British and French. If you like this recording, you know where to find the button for that. I would be most grateful if you would click it. Thank you for listening.